Hello, and welcome to today's webcast. I'm Lisa Ward, Director of Education for Maddie's Fund. Our topic today is change management, and we're delighted to welcome Dr. Cristie Kamiya, Chief of Shelter Medicine at the Humane Society of Silicon Valley. Under her leadership, HSSV was the first shelter in the country to complete and document all of the Association of Shelter Veterinary guidelines for standards of care in animal shelters. She holds a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree and an MBA from Colorado State University and is one of a handful of residency-trained shelter veterinarians in the country. Welcome, Dr. Kamiya.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And as Lisa said, we'll be talking about change management. Change is hard, but there are change management principles to make hard changes a little more simple. So I'm from the Humane Society of Silicon Valley, and we are a private nonprofit shelter founded in 1929. We have one animal control contract with the city of Sunnyvale. Our intake this past fiscal year was about 7,100 animals, and about 55% of that were transfers from other shelters. So part of our role in our community, we are part of a coalition of shelters in Santa Clara County, and our role is as a safety net for other shelters and rescues, and the majority of what we do is taking in animals from our partner shelters and also shelters from other parts of the Bay Area and Central Valley and other parts of California. About 30% are strays, from the city of Sunnyvale, and about 46% are felines, 51% canines, and of that, about 38% of our intake are kittens, and about 25% are puppies. So why change management? As Lisa mentioned, we did undertake this overwhelmingly gigantic, crazy project a few years ago to complete the guidelines. And it was a multi-year project that involved pretty much everybody in the entire organization, from the board, the executive management teams, all the way down to our line staff. And once we were all on board, and that was a process as well, getting on board to actually make this happen, then it was like, holy moly, okay, so now what? It was uncharted waters for us. We had never done that before. In fact, no one else had done this before, and we needed we needed some organization, and we needed some steps for us to be able to execute on this and also document everything. I mean, that was the big thing about completing these, is that we wanted to document it in a way that we could then share with other shelters. So this change management process that I'll be talking about, this was something that our HR department created. And because what we were embarking on was cultural change, it was cultural change within our shelter. That's much more than deciding one day that you're going to make a change and then sending out a memo to everyone and then expecting that to stick. This was much more. The changes that we were making were very intentional, and there was a lot of thought behind these changes, and we wanted to make sure that these changes were successful and that they would be sustainable into the future. So a few key takeaways. One, I want to acknowledge that change is really, really hard. And I don't want to appear to be oversimplifying or what is the word that I'm looking for? I mean, I just want to acknowledge that it is really hard. And the reason for putting in processes is because it is really hard. And, putting in a process for how to go about change in a systematic fashion, it really does simplify the process for us. So that's one less thing that you have to think about and you have to worry about. And that way you can focus your energies on actually executing on these changes. The other key takeaway is that effective change management takes time. This is not an overnight plan. You'll have to make sure that you're in it for the long haul, and that you're committed, and that there's also a lot of trust and respect between the people inflicting the change and the people who are actually implementing and executing on those changes. And also, when this is done, and it's done well, it truly is transformational. The changes that we've made over the past few years have been transformational for HSSV. We've increased our intake in the past 5 years from about 4,800 to 7,100 in the course of 5 years. And we did that in a way that did not increase our staffing levels. It increased our capacity for care, and it increased our capacity to help other shelters. So by making a few changes in our own internal processes, we've been able to effectively increase the life-saving capacity and the live release rate for our entire community. So we'll go over some of those things. So as I mentioned, some of our greatest unhappiness in life comes from pushing against inevitable change. Depending on the person and their individual perceptions, change may be viewed as good or bad or meh. It may not affect anything. But just knowing that there are differences in how people interpret change that are presented to them. There are many unknowns that come with it, and that's really, really scary. And our job as leaders is to inspire our staff to, step outside of their comfort zones, and also to give them the confidence to step into these uncharted waters. And also, the big thing is that knowing that it's okay to do things differently, and it's okay to not get it right on the first time. I mean, I'll be mentioning that a few times, but making it okay to fail at first is really important for supporting our staff. Again, people have different adaptability thresholds, so different people will be able to cope with being overwhelmed and with the unknown. There's varying levels, and so being aware of that and being able to adjust your support to the needs of different people, that's really important. And finally, we do know that when you do make a change and it goes poorly, that can have a pretty detrimental impact on your organization and your ability to present and affect changes in the future. So I just wanted to take a quick poll. There's this fancy new feature here, and I just wanted to check that out. So how many of you have had a change that hasn't gone well? And go ahead and hit the red thumb if that is the case. So it looks like a lot of people have had changes that have not gone well. It's like 47%. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thanks for participating. All right, so here's a little chart here, and this is your typical distribution of an organization and how they would respond to change. So you have your 20% resistors, and these are people who are adamant about not wanting to change. They like how things are going. They don't want to change. They're not open to it. And then you have your champions at the other end of the spectrum. These are the ones who want the change. These are the ones who are leading the change. They're motivated. They want to do this, and they are charging ahead with it. And then you have your helpers who also encourage the change, and these are your cheerleaders. They're the ones who are cheering everyone on, and they may not be the leaders, but they are there supporting the leaders, and they are there supporting the changes all the way through. And then you have this huge middle portion, and the majority of the organization who are just bystanders, and they're kind of like, meh, the change, it may or may not affect me. That's cool to do it, but I'm perfectly happy not changing at all. And what we want to do when we're looking at changes and when we're trying to implement new processes or new procedures or any cultural change, what we really want to do is target these bystanders, target the ones who are pretty neutral on the topic, and find a way to switch them over and help them make the jump from bystanders to helpers, and perhaps even to champions. With the resistors, we do know that some powerful resistors, I mean, they can derail a project if that's, if given the opportunity. And so the question is, well, how do we deal with these resistors? And what if they don't want to change? And what if they don't want to help out? And what if they continue to poo-poo our process changes? What we try to do is give them the benefit of the doubt and give them every opportunity possible to make that jump, to bystanders or to helper or champions. And sometimes your biggest champions actually started out as the biggest resistors, and so it is definitely worthwhile to, to focus your attention on these resistors and do everything you can to change their minds. However, a lot, some of the times, and maybe even a lot of the times, or most of the time, you're not able to change their minds. There may be a genuine misalignment in visions or in missions or goals between the resistor and the organization, and for the most part, these people will select themselves out. And for the ones who don't, this is, at some point they're going to have to get on the train because it's leaving. And it's going to be up to you to determine where that cutoff will be and how much, how much you're going to allow the resistors to remain there. This is the different levels of change management as a factor of time. So as time goes on, you start with awareness. You want to implement a change in your shelter. You want to do the ASC guidelines. And you create this awareness around, and this is targeting your bystanders and trying to get them towards becoming a helper or a champion. And during the awareness time, you're presenting the changes and you're presenting the plans and why the changes need to get done or what's in it for them. And then you take it a step higher to the acceptance stage. And this is where people are okay, this is cool, we're going to be making this change, and they're all on board. And then they actually adopt the changes. So this is the implementation and execution stage where you're making these changes. And these changes are sticking. And you eventually end up in advocacy. And this is where everyone's a cheerleader and everyone is happy with the change and everyone is sharing what you've done. And this is our end goal. I mean, this is what we want. This is the ideal situation. So an example that I want to share is with our organization is cutting portals into our stainless steel cages. So that was a huge change for our organization several years ago. There was this misconception that the more cats or the more animals you have in your organization or in your shelter, the more cages that you can squeeze in, the more lives you will save. And there is enough information out there to know that that is not the case at all. Your life-saving capacity doesn't necessarily increase by sticking cats and dogs in every single crevice in your shelter, and in fact, it can have the opposite effect. And so cutting cages, that was a huge issue for our shelter. We had a lot of resistors, probably more than the 20%, and we had myself as the champion and perhaps maybe one or two other people who were on board at that time. And it took a while. I mean, it really did take a lot of time to create this awareness and acceptance for these changes. Things that we did, I did presentations at team meetings. I did presentations at all staff, at board meetings. We even played the length of stay game at the board meeting and at one of our all-staff meetings. And finally, I just made a promise. I made a promise that we will make this change and we will not increase our euthanasia rate. And it was a total leap of faith on the part of the organization to go ahead and cut these holes in the cage. And but the end result, and over time, as we collected data and we got more data, and our numbers showed what we were sort of feeling and what we were kind of feeling. So one of the first benefits that people started to notice when we did cut portals into our cages is that our upper respiratory infection rates were going down. Or actually even before that, people were noticing that we had empty kennels all over the shelter. We had empty kennels in isolation, we had empty kennels in adoptions, and people started getting suspicious. There were a few people who said, hey, where are all the animals? Did you guys euthanize them all? And that wasn't the case. What happened was, just by cutting the holes in the cages, we decreased our upper respiratory infection rate, and our isolation were sitting empty because we had pretty much eliminated shelter-acquired disease in our shelter, and we had this huge open capacity. And so our staff were able to see firsthand the effects of this change that we just made. And they're like, hey, this is pretty cool. And we have the data to back this up. And now, several years later, our staff are the biggest advocates of cutting cages. I mean, it's part of our everyday world. And and we do have policies around when portals can and can't be closed. Our default is that portals are always open. And so when a staff member sees a portal close, they start getting anxious because they understand the value of the changes that we made and understand, and they advocate for that. So in any type of change, that is our ideal. We want people to make that jump from awareness all the way to advocacy and promoting the changes that we were made. So how did we do all these changes? I keep talking about all this. So we have this 8-step process. So 8 steps to transforming your organization. And we'll go over the next few slides talking about each one of these individually. So the first one is creating a sense of urgency. Why are we making this change? What are we going to gain from it? Is it going to make life better for us? Is it going to create less work for us? What is the urgency? Is there a parvo outbreak, or is there a canine influenza outbreak that is necessitating change? What is it? And creating this sense of urgency brings attention to this change that you're wanting to implement. A few of the pitfalls that we want to avoid and things to be aware of is that the status quo might be too comfortable. If it ain't broke, why are you going to fix it? Why you want to improve things? I mean, we're doing pretty well already. Or your urgency just isn't compelling enough and it's not, gaining the attention of anyone. Or you have leaders. And your leaders, they don't have to be the ones on the leadership team. Your leaders are also your supervisors, your managers, other people in the shelter. If they're not on board with the change and they don't participate with creating the sense of urgency, that's not going to help the cause. The second step is forming a guiding coalition. So what you want to do is assemble a group of people with enough power or with enough clout in the organization to lead the change. And these are people who can do a full assessment and of the problems, the opportunities. These are your problem solvers. And this does not have to be your management or your leadership team. This can be anyone in the organization who is a champion of this cause that can be part of this guiding coalition. And the requirements that are there is that they just need to be respectful and trust one another and trust that everyone is on board and that they are headed in the same direction, and they're all on the same plate. Pitfalls here is that there isn't enough buy-in. So you want to make sure that your guiding coalition, your change champions are there, and they do have full buy-in, and they are on board. And you also need to be able to work as a team, because if you don't have a unified front, it's going to be really, really difficult to then influence others to make that change. The third one is creating a vision. What is your elevator pitch? Can you articulate what you want to accomplish with this change in 3 minutes? Do you know what you want to do? Can you talk about it? Do you have one? One of the strategies can use is, making sure that it's focused, it's attainable, it's tangible, and also utilizing inspiration versus forcing people to accept the change is being able to inspire people who want to also change. That is a much more effective way of implementing change. So going back to the portal example, the question that we kept getting is like, why would you do that? Why do you want to do that? Well, because we want to increase our life-saving capacity. We want to increase space for individual cats, even though we know that it'll decrease the overall functional space in the shelter, because we know that stressed cats get sick in the shelter. Sick cats stay longer, which means that's more work for staff. There's less cats that can come through the shelter, and it's just more crowded. But if you can decrease the sick cats, that's also going to decrease the length of stay for cats and create less work, which means more cats can be cared for overall. So pretty simple. I mean, it's a pretty simple vision we had for cutting holes in cages, is that we just wanted to save more lives. And another example that you can go through is like, why did we want to do the ASV guidelines in the first place? Well, we wanted the highest standard of care for our shelter animals. At that time, when we were talking about it, there were no other shelters that completed all of the guidelines. And here in Silicon Valley, we have a very supportive community who believes in our mission, and we also have the resources to do them. So incentive-wise, I mean, there really is no certification. I mean, we don't get this certificate saying that we achieved all of the guidelines. However, we felt that it was the right thing to do, and we wanted to be the best, the model shelter, and be the first one to finish it. So those were all pretty clear, pretty simple visions for that. So some of the pitfalls to avoid with this is that if you don't have a clear vision for what you're wanting to change, it could be confusing. You might have conflicting goals between the different people in your coalition, your guiding coalition, or you may end up with scope creep. You may end up going down different paths that weren't intended in the original intent. So some of the ways, the principles for inspiring change is change what's needed and not what's easy. So, for our cats cutting holes, that was a no-brainer for us. We had single compartment housing. Our isolation areas were always full because we had sick cats that would come in, they would get sick, they would go to ISO. That wasn't an easy change, but we knew we needed to change it. You want to re-recruit your best people. Again, these are your champions. They can be leadership team down to line staff level. You want them on board with this. You want to be able to forget for success. So this is all of your previous beliefs and your previous biases, your previous why are we doing this, your legacy issues or anything like that. So you want to be able to get past all of that and to have a clean slate to be able to move forward with your changes. And it just starts with a belief. This is what we want to do, this is what we should do, and we should just go for it. I'm not going to go over every single one of these, and you can certainly read that, but I think you all get the point with that. But one thing I do want to mention is that you want to make sure that you have the ability to measure your results. You want to be able to create metrics or key performance indicators or any type of method to be able to collect data to track your changes, and that way you can go back if needed. And also the other thing that was big for our staff is to be able to fail, to be able to try and iterate. So just because something didn't work 2 years ago doesn't mean you can't revisit it. And even if things don't work out the first try or the second try or the third try, that's okay too, because you have the ability to learn from these failures and go back and make a few changes, redirect or course correct or whatever you need to do in order to be able to move forward. And also, the other thing that we found that was really helpful for us is to create pilot programs. Pilot programs are awesome. They are no commitment trials to try something new and crazy that may or may not work, but it takes a lot of the pressure off of staff of needing to succeed the first time around. So just try it out. If it doesn't work, it was just a pilot project, so you can either scrap it or go back and try again at some later point. And also, everyone responds to positive reinforcement. So if you do something good, you really do want to click and treat. So step 4, you got your vision, you got your elevator pitch. Now you need to be able to communicate it. If you can't communicate it, that you're not going to be able to move forward. And so you want to use as many modes of communication as necessary. Depending on the different projects, you may want to do different types of communications, either in person, town hall meetings, emails, all of the above. And you also want to be able to make sure that your guiding coalition, these are your champions, that they are walking the talk. Like they are setting the example for everyone else in the shelter. They are doing the changes. They're participating. They are on board. They're not and they're not going to sabotage your efforts. You want to make sure that people understand the why of a change, and you don't want to get into this do as I say, not as I do, but you want to be able to have them learn all of the information behind why the changes are important, why it matters, and that helps people get on board and to be inspired to make these changes versus being forced to have these changes that are inflicted upon them. And pitfalls here, cynicism among staff because of ineffective communication, or they're seeing people or their bosses or their managers, undermining what's supposed to be happening. And with that, you end up losing a lot of credibility and confidence in your vision and in your message, and it gets then it gets much harder to then implement those changes. And once that's communicated and once everyone is on board, then you really want to empower people to act on the vision. So, and this is where, we decided, hey, we're going to go forward and do these ASV guidelines. And so then it's like, well, now what? What is it going to look like? And what are the next steps? What are the logistics around this? Do we have a timeline? And how do we do this? And what we found to be super helpful is involving as many people as we could in the process, and brainstorming, allowing people to get creative. No matter how far-fetched your ideas might be or how crazy or whatever, we want that. We want to know what people are thinking, and we want these new ideas, and then we talk about them, and we may or may not be able to implement them, but if they're a cool idea, we may put them on a shelf and revisit them at some later point. You want to be able to remove obstacles to these changes. So if you want to move forward as an organization to make these changes, you want to make sure that the resources are there. You want to make sure that that there aren't barriers to these changes. So I'll go back to the ASV guidelines again. This was an organizational change that we had all agreed on, and that it was incorporated in our organizational goals. It was a multi-year goal. Everyone was on board. And knowing that it was going to take a lot of work, we also made sure that our managers had enough bandwidth to actually start looking at how to implement these. So that's really important. You can't just inflict this change on someone and expect them to be able to do it on top of everything else that they're doing. They're really busy. Everyone is really busy. And so, again, making sure that the resources are available and people are given the chance to implement these changes. And some pitfalls around here. If you don't remove those obstacles or those barriers, you're not going to succeed. You're not going to be able to move forward as quickly or at all without that. So step 6. So this is where you're actually doing the work and you're moving forward, and this is where you click and treat. We're going to try something. It works out or it doesn't work out. That's cool. Click, treat. And not everyone works well with delayed gratification. The ASV guidelines project for us took 2 years. So one of the things we did was to split that up into 1-year goals. At the very beginning, when we decided to make these organizational goals, we were at 87% of the way done with those 543 guidelines. The first year, we set the goal at 93% completion. And then the second year, we did it at 100% completion. And the reason for that is, who has the stamina to keep going with no reward for a couple of years? It can get really tiring. And so we wanted to be able to shorten things up and to make sure that things were attainable, that these goals that we were setting were attainable. And we also want to be able, we want to make sure that we're able to celebrate goals too. So every time a new accomplishment was done, and every time a new project was completed, we celebrated that. We acknowledged that and made a huge deal about that, because that kept the momentum going, that kept the motivation and the urgency up to continue to go in this longer haul project. Pitfalls here: loss of momentum, or getting so caught up in the day-to-day stuff that you kind of lose sight of what your original goal was, and you sort of veer off kind of doing something totally different. And so you want to make sure that even with these longer-term projects, that you have your end game in sight and that you are aware of what that goal is. And when things get too tiring and you start losing steam, you run the risk of having these champions and helpers of the organizational change sort of slip backwards into the bystander and resistor categories, and that's something that you really do not want. Step 7, you want to build on these short-term wins and building on that momentum to then implement even more changes. And so you want to be able to leverage all of these wins that you had to then help support the new initiatives that you want to start tackling. And the cat cage project was a perfect example of this. Staff were noticing that, hey, our cages are empty. And with our position being the safety net for other shelters, then the question was brought up, hey, we have all these empty cages. What if we start transferring more cats from our partner shelters? How about transferring in some upper respiratory infection cats, because our isolation cages are empty and we have these rooms empty? And so that's what we did. We were able to increase the number of, because we had eliminated shelter-acquired URI in our shelter, the only cats left with URI in our shelter were the ones that came in with it. And knowing that our partner shelters sometimes have trouble keeping up with the upper respiratory infection in their shelters, it was a no-brainer for us. We started transferring in our upper respiratory infection, bringing them in as a cohort, and bringing in an entire room of upper respiratory infection cats to be treated here. And then we extended that to other things like ringworm and parvo, and we'll talk about parvo a little bit later. But that was one of the ways that we were able to increase not just our own life-saving capacity, but also affecting the live release rate for our entire community, for all of Santa Clara County. And that was all just by cutting holes in our cages, which seemed like such a really, small thing. The other pitfalls for that, declaring victory too soon. So you don't want to, stop too soon and halt any progress without reaching that end game. And you don't want to celebrate too early or too soon. You want to celebrate some, but you want to make sure that you have your eye on that ultimate goal and your ultimate end game. And you also don't want anything that will kill the momentum. You have a lot of wins behind you, and you want to keep going and doing a lot more things. You don't just want to stop, because that's a perfect way of reverting back. And then once everything is done, what is our end game? Our end game is that we want this process change to be the way we do things here. So when we were first confronted with a new change, we're like, well, why do we want to do that? This is how we've always done it. And all of a sudden, at the end of your change management project, and you're at step 8, and all of a sudden this new change, this is the way we do things around here. Like, that's a really, really cool thing to see and to evolve, but that's what you want. This is your cultural change. This is how we do things. This is our new normal. This is what we do on a regular day. This is our day-to-day thing. So just to recap, this is our 8 steps to transforming your organization. I won't go over it again. You'll have access to a copy of these slides. But what I did want to do is offer an example of one of a recent change. Well, it's not so recent anymore. This is probably about 3 or so years ago, where we had a problem in our shelter that we wanted to solve, and we utilized this process. So Parvovirus, as we all know, is deadly to puppies in shelters. It is an awful disease to experience, and for us at that point, a positive test result, a positive SNAP test, meant euthanasia for the most part. We were able sometimes to send puppies with parvo to a referral clinic to be treated off-site, but for the most part, if they came in and they were positive, they were euthanized. Some of the reasoning behind that was that it was too difficult to treat, it was too resource-intensive to treat in a shelter, and it's difficult to contain in the shelter. One of the big fears is that there would be a huge outbreak of parvo in our shelter if we decided to treat it. And people were afraid of parvo. People were afraid of parvo because of things that happened or outbreaks that happened like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and they were still holding on to that legacy and had that bias in the shelter where, oh no, we can't possibly treat it here. But one thing we did know, and one thing that we all agreed on, was that treating parvo would save lives. Being able to at least consider it would be able to potentially save lives. So it's just started with the question of, well, why not? Why don't we treat it? Yeah, there may have been a parvo outbreak 20 years ago that killed a lot of puppies in our shelter, but that's not our shelter. We're a totally different shelter, and why not? Why can't we do it now? So that's how it started. We were able to, over a course of several weeks, probably more close to a couple of months of talking with various stakeholders, This conversation started in a manager's meeting. It's like, hey, why don't we do this? And then the conversation was taken to a doctor's meeting. It involved everyone else in the shelter, and we decided ultimately we're going to try this. We're going to try this. This is going to be new for us. It might suck, and this is kind of uncomfortable because we've never purposely put parvo puppies in our shelter. And this was totally outside of our comfort zone, but we made the decision that we were going to go ahead anyway. So here's our eight steps. We established a sense of urgency. Parvo puppies dying in our shelter. We were not okay with that anymore. We have a mission here at HSSV to save and enhance lives. We are also, with our pet evaluation matrix, the way that we categorize different animals coming into our shelter, there were two categories of parvo. One was that moderate to severe cases of parvo were considered untreatable, unrehabilitatable, but mild parvo was considered a treatable, rehabilitatable process. And as a shelter, and in fact as a community, we were already saving all of our healthies in our community in all of Santa Clara County. We had committed to that years ago as a recipient of the Maddie's Life-Saving Award. And so we had made that commitment that we would save every single healthy animal in our community. And saving TRs were just the next step. Like, hey, we're saving all the healthies. There is no reason for us not to be able to save the ones that are treatable. We formed a powerful guiding coalition, so we got the blessing from the leadership team. The rest of the operations team was on board. The managers were all on board. This was a cross-functional process where it involved pretty much every department in operations, and so we needed to get the buy-in of everyone. And we were able to form a core group who were going to be our champions of this. We created a vision, and it was pretty simple. We wanted to save and enhance the lives of parvo puppies in our shelter. It was as simple as that. Communicating this, we talked about meeting with all of the different constituents, all of our different stakeholders in different departments, our doctors and our medical staff. It was pretty split between people who are for and who are against it. We had some long-term staff here who were adamantly against doing this, so like, hey, we can't do this. But we also had staff who were for it. And same with our animal care. Our medical teams would be responsible for treating the puppies, but our animal care team would be responsible for making sure that they were kept clean and that biosecurity measures were adhered to. So it really was a group effort, and we also answered as many of the questions as we could that came up, and also tried to answer any anticipated questions or any anticipated problems that might arise. And after all of these, we were able to have some level of comfort to start doing this. So for step 5 and 6, we set some criteria at first. We wanted to make sure that we were able to gain a few wins, especially for the sake of our line staff or our medical team who would be responsible for caring for these puppies. So we actually started pretty small. We set the criteria where they had to be mild. We did blood work, sort of as a screening, looked at their protein levels, their white blood cell count, and if they needed overnight critical care, we did euthanize those puppies. But if we could treat them on an outpatient basis using Colorado State's protocol, then we were going to try with that. And those were the first puppies that we tried. And we were able to, we were successful. And we celebrated every single puppy coming out of the puppy isolation. And we also enlisted our marketing team to make a huge deal about these puppies. And what that did was it created a sense of pride in our staff who were responsible for getting these sick puppies who would have otherwise died up for adoption and out into their new homes. Like, that was a huge deal for our staff, huge wins. And that for us was really, really important. So as we got better with these milder cases, we were able to then say, hey, we're really good at this. Why don't we change this so we can include more puppies? And we started being a little more loose with the criteria, and eventually eliminated the criteria where, hey, we can do this. The staff were at the point where, hey, we can do this, we can handle this, we can handle the more critical ones, we will figure this out. And so we used those wins, those successes they had early on with those mild puppies. We were able to then leverage that to then start opening this up to puppies that were a little bit more critical. And we even took it a step further as we got even better with that and started transferring cases of parvo from other shelters to our shelter here to be treated and put up for adoption. And that was, again, a huge deal for staff because they knew that these puppies were at risk at other shelters and probably would not have had the opportunity to be treated and to be adopted. And so that was another huge win. And this is the coolest part. This is several years out now. Treating parvo here is, it's not a huge deal anymore. It's just a part of our day-to-day. We almost always have a parvo puppy or two or a litter or 10 in our parvo isolation areas. And it's huge. And our staff have gotten really good at that. Our line staff, our medical team. And what we have done most recently as our next step in this progression is we have actually started standing orders, and we have some standing orders for parvo puppies who arrive here after hours or after our medical team have already, or after the veterinarians have already left for the day, where technicians know what needs to get done. They're there doing the tests, confirming it, putting in the catheters, starting the IV fluids and the antibiotics and things like that. So it is now part of our normal day-to-day. And the other cool thing is that the success of treating parvo in-house has also given us the ability to even consider treating other things. And one of what our next step in our natural progression as we go down this path of parvo treatment is Panleukopenia. So that is our current project of treating Panleukopenia. Because we were so successful with parvo, and we have a ton more kittens than we do puppies, again, it started with a question of like, hey, we treat parvo here now. Why don't we treat Panleukopenia? Why don't we give that a shot? And I am very, very happy to say that we have been, our success rate is not as high as parvo puppies, which is probably around 90% that we were able to save. But for the kittens, it's not quite that high, but we are doing it and we are getting better. And so the point that I wanted to share is that once you create this culture of change and problem solving and being open to doing things differently, the possibilities are endless. Like, it is so cool to watch the progression of HSSV from siloed departments going through turf wars between staffing to now having this cross-functional team performing and working as one cohesive unit and problem solving together. I mean, it's been really, really cool, and it truly has been transformational for us to be able to make some changes, to make a lot of changes over the past few years. So just to recap some of the key takeaways, change is really, really hard. And I'm not going to lie, some of the changes that we've implemented really did suck. And they were really hard, and they took a really long time, took a lot of effort, a lot of resources, and some tears. But we did, with this process, we're able to simplify the changes, and we were able to then create this change machine that we've become. And we've learned to work together. We've learned to trust each other on different levels of the organization, and we have become a transformed organization as a result of that. So with that, I want to thank you Here are some few references if you're interested in reading more about change management. And with that, I would love to open this up to any questions that there might be.
All right, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'm going to push a couple questions here to a slide, and let's see if we can answer just a few questions here. How scientifically did this change cause a decrease in upper respiratory problems?
Okay, so for this, we actually had data. So we know there's studies out there that, that support decreasing stress in shelter cats will decrease your upper respiratory. So we know that the majority of the upper respiratory infection that we do see in a shelter is caused by herpes recrudescens, which is stress-induced. And we know that by changing their housing, you can decrease the stress. So we had data from before our incidence and our upper respiratory rate prior to cutting holes in the cages, and we had data afterwards, and it was like a 20% decrease in the number of cases of upper respiratory infection that we saw in the shelter. So we did keep track of those data for a little while. However, when we started increasing our transfers of upper respiratory infection from other shelters, it became a little more challenging for us to keep track of that. But our shelter-acquired upper respiratory infection, which was probably like 25% or more prior to cutting holes in cages, I mean, that went down to single digits. And it was a very dramatic decrease that we saw year over year.
Thank you for that. Here's your next question. Any suggestions when the whole shelter is on board with the change, except upper management?
That is really hard. So I sort of faced this with our decision to move forward with cutting holes in our cages. The cutting portals, that was a hard one for the organization because there really was that misconception of, less cage space equaled more euthanasias, and that was challenging. It probably took me a good year of just socializing this concept to the entire organization. So what you will want is data. You want facts and data to back up what you want to implement. And you also, bring in people if you need to, suggest a consult if you need to. Like I mentioned earlier, in order to gain the support and the buy-in and to help our board understand the concept of length of stay, we played the length of stay game. We made them get up and play it. If that's something that you want to do, I can't remember. There's a video, I think, on the ASPCA Pro where there's a video on the length of stay game. But we actually played that game, and the purpose of playing the game was to get an understanding. So so the approach that I took was not, this is the change I want to implement in the shelter, but the approach I took with everyone is, this is where we are currently, and this is what I need everyone to understand. We have upper respiratory infection in the shelter, and it is caused by the stress of being in a single compartment cage for however long they live in there. That is causing this. By taking that away, taking that stress away, this is the result that you are going to expect to have happen. And so I think if you can present it in a way, it might be different from what your end goal is, but if you can present it in a way that that they can understand and they can visualize, and that's something that's maybe tangible, it might be, more easily accepted. So if I went directly in and said, hey, I'm going to cut holes in all of these stainless steel cages, I would not have been successful at all. But sort of taking a few steps back and really focusing on length of stay and illness in the shelter, we were able to eventually get to cutting holes in cages. And I'm happy to chat more about offline if you'd like.
For sure. Let's get one more question in here. Is there a recommended limit to how many changes you should try to undertake at any one time? Is there change fatigue?
Oh, there is absolutely change fatigue, and you know, this is why you want to make sure that you keep the momentum going, that you have your small wins, and you are clicking and treating. That's a hard question to answer because it all depends on your staff, and so you want to make sure when you are creating a lot of changes, especially these cultural changes, that you have a pulse on your staff and you have a pulse on what's happening. And being flexible enough where you can course correct if you need, or if you can go or slow down or speed up. So it really depends on the organization. The way that I explained this was, you know, so change management is not necessarily a linear process. I mean, you have a lot of things going on, and you have simultaneous changes. We did have a lot of different changes going on at the same time, and yeah, the change fatigue can happen, definitely. Great question, Russ.
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you, Dr. Kamiya. That was fantastic. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we thank all of our viewers for watching. I'm not sure we can get all these questions in, but for those of you who'd like to continue today's discussion or have more questions for Dr. Kamiya, please visit the Maddie's Pet Forum webcast group. Thanks for watching and for all you're doing to help the animals.